us, whichever way you are checking us out tonight, to the Sports Grumble podcast, also known as the Grumblecast. Tonight we're going to be focusing on fantasy football. Grant Doepel here with you, and we'll be joined in just a second by our fantasy football guru, Cory Hopwood. And Cory, we'll just go ahead and bring you in, and we're doing something different tonight, and we're going to try a Google Hangouts podcast, if you will. We'll record the audio too and give it available, or make it available for podcast as well, but hopefully this is another way that our readers and listeners will enjoy connecting with us here at Sports Grumble. So, Cory, I thank you for joining me tonight, and let's go ahead and dive in if you're ready to go.
Absolutely.
All right, and the first thing we're going to talk about tonight is, obviously sticking with fantasy football, our biggest, and when I say our, I mean Cory's, biggest busts and surprises of the year. So, Cory, let's go ahead and start with your biggest, I guess your one biggest, or however many you have, bust so far on the year.
So I kind of tried to skip over a lot of the busts that have to do with injury or suspensions. We saw a lot of those this year. Seemed like a high year for injuries, especially heading into practices, even preseason games before we even got the season started. And then we saw the suspensions like Ray, Rice, and Adrian Peterson went under. So we'll try to avoid really going through those. But some of the guys that were, for the majority of the year, healthy and still just kind of didn't meet our expectations, or we wasted draft picks on guys like Zach Stacy, who is now like fighting for carries, fighting for touches. It's pretty much drafted in the first three rounds, and now he's fairly useless to most fantasy owners, and not only hurt people trying to get into the fantasy playoffs, but also hurt them throughout the season and may have kept them from getting in the playoffs at all. Guys like Doug Martin, who may have suffered a little bit of injury along the way. I defended Doug Martin heading into the season as far as his athletic ability, what he looked like on the film versus even against good defenses with his bad O-line. I tried to defend him even in the first few seasons of the week, but as the season went on, I think what looked like injury and what looked like a running back by committee approach from Lovie Smith there in Tampa kind of hurt those type of guys.
Well, let me ask you real quick before you go on. Let me ask you about Doug Martin. He is somebody that a lot of people were high on going into the year, and somebody who, as you mentioned, has a great talent. Looking at going forward, and Lovie Smith obviously not having the year he'd like to have his first season in Tampa Bay, do you think Doug Martin is the guy in Tampa Bay going forward for Lovie Smith and the Buccaneers?
I'm not sold on him as being the guy. A lot of hype came about Charles Sims throughout the end of the season there. I actually picked him up in a couple of leagues in hopes that he might turn into something more than a third down back. So far, I haven't seen a whole lot of it, but I think maybe with a full year to get him in the lineup, he might get more work. I liked Doug Martin coming off of last year a lot, so it's hard for me to count him out already. They are using him for the majority of their carries currently, but if he's in that Tampa offense, I really worry. They're going to have to do a lot of work on that offensive line, or at least find a way to get those 8-man boxes away. It seems like even with that receiving core, they can't get a quarterback capable of backing that defense up.
All right, sorry to cut you off. Keep going with your bus.
The only other guys I'm really looking at are really the guys that, I don't know, a season ago maybe surprised us, or even when they weren't hurt by injury, they were useful. Guys like maybe a Reggie Bush, who if you thought could stay healthy the whole year could be a game changer. The same way we look at like a DeMarco Murray. If he stays healthy the whole season, he can really save your fantasy season and take you all the way through the playoffs. But even when guys like Bush, similar to Martin, were healthy, it seemed like they couldn't get any room behind those lines. Bernard Pierce in Baltimore is a similar case. Gio, when he was healthy for the Bengals, didn't surprise anyone with anything spectacular. And these are all guys you used high draft picks on, and you really expected a lot out of them. Among quarterbacks, the Matthew Staffords of the world, who even with Calvin in the lineup, Megatron in the lineup, you weren't really getting what you expected out of an improved receiving core and an offense that was supposed to become more efficient with their additions. At other positions, like tight end, you brought back Julius Thomas, who started the season off looking like the guy that we all drafted, early third round, late second round, but then now down the stretch has become hampered by injury and kind of fallen out of sights for Peyton. And we all know that if you can't get a tight end that's scoring touchdowns, you're going to have a rough season at a position that's already pretty sparse for starters.
Let me ask you about Julius Thomas for a minute. He's someone that's interesting. I don't know if any of our listeners really follow Pete Prisco on CBSSportsline.com, but Pete Prisco said he doesn't know that Julius Thomas anymore is an elite pass catcher in the NFL, and that he doesn't think that he would be willing to give that much money or put that much money into Thomas when he hits the free agent market. Obviously, Thomas is still a little hampered by injury, as apparently are most people on the Denver Broncos team. When you look at what the future holds for Thomas in Denver while Manning is still there, yesterday was obviously not a good representation of the possibilities with the Broncos, but are you concerned with the future of Thomas's tenure in Denver?
I don't know if I'm worried about him in Denver. I am worried about him if Peyton can't find what used to be his solid throwing motion. He's struggled a lot over the last few weeks here. For a guy that people drafted in the first round, you expect Peyton Manning to be throwing those 5 touchdown games that we got used to last year. But Julius Thomas as a pass catcher, I'm not worried, since his athleticism usually makes up for any lack in that ability. I do believe injury has had a lot to do with his slide, and I don't know if I'd be ready to pay him money on the Denver Broncos end, but I would be definitely willing to keep him around and give him another chance, see what he's like when he's healthy. He is a guy who has injury history, so it does scare me a little as a fantasy owner to continue going back to the well, but he is obviously a red zone threat, even at 75%.
How much do you think that the signing of Emmanuel Sanders, obviously a new weapon for Peyton Manning and Adam Gase in Denver, how much do you think that his presence and his emergence as one of Manning's top and favorite targets, as he now has over 90 catches and I want to say over 1,000 yards on the season, how much has his role and an increasing role in the Denver offense affected Thomas's play and production?
I don't know if he really hurts Thomas. I always thought that he was a key to opening Thomas up. He runs a lot of those go routes and deeper routes because he's got the speed or the over-the-top ability that a guy like Welker really doesn't have. You don't see Welker running up the sideline for long catches. You see him going across the middle. If anyone was going to steal catches from Julius, I feel like it would be Welker. But also, when they send Julius out, they like to send him up the middle a little bit deeper. Like to get him up high in the end zone, get him jumping. He is an athlete. They want to get him off the ground, use that size. They don't use him in that check down way that we see maybe like a Jason Witten or some of the slower, more position-based tight ends. So I don't think Emmanuel Sanders hurts Julius Thomas by any means. The touchdown numbers kind of make you think that maybe he'd be stealing some of those red zone targets, but the types of touchdowns Emmanuel Sanders gets are fairly different from the type that I see Julius getting.
Any more busts on your list, Cory?
I don't have any more busts this year, or at least none that I'm going to break into.
Well, let's take a look at your pleasant surprises on the year.
I guess the closest thing that I have left to bust would be one of my biggest surprises on the good side was Justin Forsett. He managed to save a lot of teams that didn't draft real well at the running back position, some of mine in particular. He did bust when we got to playoffs, and you'll have that. You'll have guys that play great all season and then decide, or their coaches decide to only give them a few carries in your championship game, but you do what you can. But guys like Forsett, guys like C.J. Anderson, who came on a little later in the season, probably carrying people through playoffs and not doing against necessarily bad run defenses. When it comes to guys like that, you're going to, in a lot of cases, your guy goes down injured, you grab his backup, or you see a position battle and you try and grab the guy that you think might come out on top, which was the case for a lot of people in Forsett's dilemma, where he was up against potentially 2 other running backs after Ray Rice was taken away. And if you were lucky, you grabbed Forsett. Other guys that really changed seasons for people, and a lot of teams that I saw later in championship games that unfortunately I found myself losing to, the Odell Beckham Jr.'s of the world that came out a little later in the season, somehow were still free agents in some leagues. Kind of what we expected out of like a Josh Gordon, but actually produced. Um, so guys like that can really save a season. They're exciting to have on your team. They're also very upsetting if they're not on your team. Some of the guys that were on teams that really showed up were the Tom Brady's, the Ben Roethlisbergers of the world. They prove that if they have the right receiving core, they can be relevant. Brady needs Gronk. Roethlisberger needs the Martavius Bryant connection where he can throw long touchdowns over the top and doesn't just have to throw those short speed routes to Antonio Brown's. And then even guys like Ryan Tannehill who can fill in and throw for 4 touchdowns in a week and completely save your season or save your playoff streak. So some of those guys, even Kyle Orton and some of the guys who aren't used to throwing for the big yardage, had a couple games this season where they'd get 5+ touchdowns and have a great week and get teams through bye weeks and really surprise a lot of people.
And I'm going to ask you this one just because, obviously I'm a Bengals fan, pleasantly surprised by last night's win. What do you make of Jeremy Hill? Not just this year, but what has he shown you this year? Can he be a back that teams take a chance on maybe next year as one of their running backs or a starting running back on their fantasy team?
Oh, definitely. I think he has the ability to be a running back one in every league. The reason I didn't include him on the great surprises list is because it seems like the Bengals are having an issue realizing that he's really a lead back. He's built like a lead back. He brings things to the table that even a Giovanni Bernard can't bring. As exciting as Bernard is to watch play, he's a third down back. He should catch balls. He should do the more exciting trick stuff. And I mean, I love that they're on the same team. It's perfect. I think they need to realize Jeremy Hill's potential, get him on the field a little more, get his carries up, because when his carries were up, he was not only a fantasy relevant back, but also a great real life running back. I'm a definite believer in Jeremy Hill, though. Absolutely.
One thing I want to ask you while we're on the topic of some running backs, and I didn't really prep you on this one, but a lot of topics around, you look at some of the chat rooms or even Reddit forums online, and there's a discussion about Le'Veon Bell and DeMarco Murray, 2 runners who have really taken the league by storm this year. If you're looking at those two in terms of who you would take, if they're both on the board for you when you're taking your fantasy draft, who would you go with first if both of those guys were on your board and available?
Well, I'm someone who usually errs on the side of caution when it comes to injuries in the fantasy world. It's hard to predict a suspension like Le'Veon was fighting earlier in the season for his pot smoking allegations and such. But the DeMarco, he seems to get injured once a season, and I wrote about this before the season started. He's the kind of guy who can change your season for you because you can get him in the second round because people are scared of his injury potential. And he's going to win you any game he plays in. He's probably going to help you win that week or be very close. So the type of workload they both get is comparable. They're both used a lot by their respective teams, passing, running, doing it all for their team. If I thought DeMarco could stay healthy for a whole season, it'd definitely be DeMarco. I harped on Le'Veon a lot last year for his low yards per carry average. I also predicted that would go up this season. Sure enough, they got him figured out. He's a sophomore in the league, so he's going to eventually figure it out. And he's only gotten better, and that offense has gotten more explosive and better, so that's taken a little pressure off him, which has opened up running lanes. And overall, he's just, besides the workload, he is a solid back, it turns out. So I'm probably taking Le'Veon if I had to choose between the two of them, just based on he's a safe play. He doesn't bring necessarily as high of an upside as DeMarco, but his floor is one of the highest in the league.
And I actually peeked today and I saw some of the questions that you have coming on your fantasy football mailbag, and one of the ones I just kind of was looking at and want to ask you on our show today is, if you have a Roethlisberger or Le'Veon Bell on your fantasy team, and you see them coming up a week, say this one coming up against the Cincinnati Bengals defense, which is mediocre, I want to say 22nd in the league this year in total defense. Which of the two, with knowing Todd Haley's offense, which of the two do you put more worth in as a fantasy owner? Would you put it more in Roethlisberger in the passing game or Le'Veon Bell and the rushing game?
Well, from a fantasy perspective, it would come down to what your team looks like besides those two at that position. So in most cases, Le'Veon's already on your team. He's starting every week, regardless of who you have on your team. Roethlisberger may have been a guy you picked up later in the season, and he's filling in for Matthew Stafford, who's playing terrible. Value-wise, you got Roethlisberger later, so Roethlisberger was the better pickup of the year between the two, but as far as who's going to be worth more this week, Le'Veon's – you can't beat a for sure – when you have a for sure running back out there to make sure you get those points. And as much as I like Roethlisberger, the Cincinnati Bengals are much more capable of defending the pass than the run, especially as of late.
Well, and you know, segueing on, you've alluded in some of your pieces about really focusing on the waiver wire. And, you know, you might have someone like Le'Veon Bell or the DeMarco Murray, as we mentioned, and with injuries, they might miss a game, or for a suspension that you didn't see coming, they may have to sit out a game or two. Let's talk for a minute, if you don't mind, about the one thing that a lot of people that play fantasy football seem to overlook, and that is the importance of the waiver wire. A lot of people put all their eggs in the draft basket, and they have these big parties in basements or over at B-dubs, and they're drafting all these big names. And that's great and all as well, but as we know in football, injuries happen, things come up. What is the importance of having a strong presence on the waiver wire throughout the entire fantasy football season?
So I've been preaching a lot to people about not getting complacent with your team. A perfect example is my team in the staff league this year for Riverfront. We had keepers. I got to keep my two best players, and then I had the second pick in the league and managed to get a guy like Jamal Charles. So my lineup never really ended up changing the whole year, and I got complacent with my starters. They all seemed good to me. But then you start seeing where you could have improved. So if I had picked up maybe, and this is an extreme case, but an Odell Beckham Jr. along the way, or someone who's in that wide receiver, even 2 or 3 range, that could have filled in for maybe like a Brandon Marshall, who certainly had stretches where he was not only injured and didn't play well, but also is now was out for the season at the end of playoffs. So if you get complacent with your starters and your bench, and you never really take a chance on the waiver wire and really leave holes in your bench where you can afford to move in a chance guy, a guy that could show up later in the weeks, a Jeremy Hill, who if he gets a starting spot, goes off like an elite running back. You have to have those, because if your team isn't getting better throughout the season, you get to playoffs, you seem to stymie, and then all of a sudden you find yourself getting third or not making it past the first round of playoffs and really missing out on what your team probably should have had all season. Great example of what happened to me in another league. Jay Cutler got benched out of nowhere. He's your starting guy, and your backup isn't anyone good. I had Eli Manning, who I wasn't going to trust, who inevitably went off for one of his best games of the season since I didn't start him. But my teammate beat me to the waiver wire, or even beat me to just the free agency, and grabbed all of the best available quarterbacks remaining, put them all on his bench, and so I'm left with either RG3 or starting Cutler's backup, Lawson, and it's not a good situation to be in. So not playing the waiver wire can leave you in situations like that. It can leave you with a complacent team that just isn't quite good enough to finish it off. I mean, you don't want to miss out on those guys. Those guys like Beckham and Hill, you don't want to miss out on them at the expense of, I saved like a James Jones on my roster all year, and we knew what James Jones was. He's a wide receiver 4. He's gonna lead his team in catches. He might get a touchdown, but it's rare, and you're not going to start him the entire season no matter what he does, and there's no potential for him to really go off at any point. If you take a chance in the waiver wire, especially with your bench players, you might get a guy like Beckham who you find out is good enough to start over one of your current starters, and then someone else doesn't get him. I like to hold on to those guys like James Jones for some reason and make sure no one else can get a hold of them. But if they're going to start a guy like that, if someone else wants to start a guy like that on their team, that's great news for you, because then it shows that they're becoming complacent with their team and they're not really looking to take a chance.
Now, when we're talking about the waiver wire, how does that affect sites such as FanDuel or DraftKings? I mean, these are sites that are really exploding onto the scene in the fantasy football world, and And some people who maybe aren't obsessed with fantasy football, they're just learning about these sites. How do you navigate things such as the waiver wire when you're playing in unique situations such as FanDuel and DraftKings?
So my interest in those daily fantasy sites really stems from being when you're busy writing about fantasy football in the early part of the week, you may not have time to attack the waiver wire, or if you maybe miss out on a guy that you really wanted from the waiver wire because you really believe that Alfred Blue, when he plays this week instead of Arian Foster, is going to go off for high running back numbers worthy of a starter. FanDuel and DraftKings and websites like that give you the opportunity to start whoever you want. So as long as you budget it correctly, those guys you can find on the waiver wire later in the week are used at pretty low salaries because as far as those websites knew when they started creating the salaries earlier in the week, the starter was still there, non-injured, and Alfred Blue was going to get 2 carries off the bench. So I like those sites because it gives you a second chance in a lot of ways. Besides just getting those players who didn't get off the waiver wire, you can continue playing after you lose or get knocked out of playoffs. So it's kind of a way to heal your wounds or just continue the fantasy football discussion even after your season's over. So even if I had a bad week in my fantasy leagues, I always had a chance of maybe still winning some cash on these weekly sites, and you get a new lineup every week. So if you really don't like your team in your other leagues, this is the way to go.
Are you secretly one of those guys named Mike or Jim who happened to win $1 million in a week, Corey?
I wouldn't do it as a secret, Grant. I'd be very vocal about it.
Real quick, talking about FanDuel and DraftKings, you've spoken a lot and you've written a lot about the two. Speak briefly, if you don't mind, talking about why these are two sites that you've really come to bring into the fold in your fantasy football experience.
So, of course, they're two of the more advertised sites. I just tried FanDuel last year at the very end of the season to check it out. I didn't pick that one for any specific reason. It just kind of popped up and I took it. All of their layouts are really easy and compatible with Excel, so if you want to look at your teams, your payouts, and all that stuff and analyze it, they make it easy. As does DraftKings. From what I've heard from my fantasy basketball writers, they've really taken to DraftKings, and it's a similar setup. Different salaries, similar setup. It just depends how they value the players. But as far as for me, I just got really interested in it as far as setting new lineups every week, and just kind of over the first couple of weeks after losing a ton of money, I got excited about maybe winning some money and trying to figure out how it's supposed to be played.
Well, before I let you go, Corey, let's talk for a minute about switching away from FanDuel and DraftKings. Let's talk about some players to watch this offseason. As always in the NFL offseason, moves are made, players switch around. The career lifespan of an NFL player is not that long, especially when you're talking about skilled positions and especially players like the running back. Lifespan not that long in the NFL. If you don't mind talking for a second about some players to keep an eye on this offseason around the league.
Absolutely. I was just talking with some friends about this the other day, actually. They were asking, what kind of rookies should I target in my rookie keeper league? And I said, well, if you haven't picked up one of the starters already that's been good all season, you have guys that you can target like Moncrief in Indianapolis or Wilson in Chicago, guys that are going to fit into roles for the veterans that are either about to leave or have had bad injuries this year, guys whose status we don't really know heading into next year, but guys that their quarterbacks really seem to like when they came into the games when they were filling in. I'm keeping an eye on Hill, like we talked about, Jeremy Hill. I'm looking to see in committee situations like that who's going to take over as the lead back. Even in places like Tampa and Carolina where they've run 3 running backs every game and you can't get a feel for what they're going to do. Buffalo's a great example, kind of waiting for like a Bryce Brown to take over around there. Those kind of situations, that's really what I spend most of the offseason doing, besides watching film and looking for just talent behind maybe a bad situation. You want to see who's going to end up with these carries and touches when the season starts up, because workload is the key to at least the positions like receiver and running back. If you're not on the field, you can't produce. If the ball's not in their hand, they can't produce. Another great example would be a Travis Kelce for the Chiefs. When he's on the field, when he's running routes, elite tight end, but he runs less routes than everybody else. So you have to look to see if they're going to incorporate guys more. Look for these younger guys that are coming up. See who they compare to. Sites like RotoViz do a really good job of comparing players to previous players. I was able to jump on DeAndre Hopkins this year, knowing that his comparables looked like that of an Alshon Jeffrey his first 2 seasons. And just kind of looking at these trends, and I mean, there's stats everywhere during the offseason, so you have to kind of pick and choose what you're going to buy into. But looking for those comparables, looking for workload, and just seeing who gets moved where can be the biggest pieces.
And obviously the season's not quite over yet, but giving a quick preview, what can our fantasy readers expect to see from you this offseason, Cory, on sportsgrumble.com?
Well, we're going to continue to cover the money games. We're going to continue to talk about FanDuel and DraftKings. I know we're going to get into some fantasy basketball. We've got some very exciting writers coming through that they know the game, and I'm trying to get them on DraftKings as much as possible. I know they play it sparingly, but get them more into the daily, weekly games so we can get some stuff up on that. You can expect a lot of the same stuff we saw last year, team breakdowns. We're going to try and follow these movements as much as possible. What I hear, I'll try and move along to the readers. And then as far as the incoming rookie class, when we know who's coming in and we know which teams they fall to, I'm sure we'll get a lot on that as well. Last season we did a lot of matchup talk. I talked a lot about matchups through my weekly rankings. We'll go back and analyze players who either were or were not affected by the matchups they were in. There are actually some players who play better against the better defenses, and there's guys who completely flop as you would expect. And just the usual, the injury concerns, that type of stuff, and we'll try and get some good projections and rankings up throughout the offseason.
And before I let you go, I do need to ask you, non-fantasy related, about the San Diego Chargers. What are your expectations this week, Cory?
Well, I'm not sure how Rivers is going to do after the injury and stuff. Their running game's kind of lacking, but I never count them out. Rivers is at least a capable quarterback. He can outsmart your defense.
So you're saying there's a chance, correct?
No.
Alrighty, well, Cory, thanks for joining me, and then hopefully our first Google Hangouts podcast, videocast, whatever you want to call it, was a success for everybody who was listening or watching today. So, Cory, once again, I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to many more of these in the future. All
right, thanks, Grant.
And that'll do it for our podcast and videocast discussing NFL fantasy football. Join us next time on sportsgrumble.com.